This is Underground Genius, and this podcast is brought to you by over a year of procrastination, some other stuff, mishaps, unforeseen events, etc., etc. These are starting to sound like excuses, but believe me, at some point I'll definitely be going over why it's taken me so long to get a new episode out, but that's not this episode. Right now, I kind of want to ease myself into it, have a little fun with it, but before I continue, I would be doing a disservice without acknowledging one person in particular. So if you are a return listener to the Underground Genius podcast, one of the things that you'll notice is the artwork is different. And the artwork, the old artwork is no more just destroy that from your brain. That's dead. Shout out to Duke. I even forgot. I'll put it in the show notes, of course. I forgot the gentleman's name who made the old artwork, but we're not talking about the old artwork anymore. The new artwork, along with some of the posters behind me, if you're on YouTube, then this part will kind of make sense, that awkward pause. The person behind both of those is a gentleman by the name of The Hand Unseen. Kind of blank there for a second, but The Hand Unseen, I know him as Josh. It's my guy. Met him on IG. We chopped it up. One of the most creative individuals I've ever had the pleasure of working with. And even from the first conversation, it was an amazing experience. The fact that I was able to connect with him and we were able to bring what was in my head into fruition. So shout out to my guy, the Hand Unseen, aka Josh. I'll definitely be putting his information in the show notes as well. Give him a follow on socials if you dig some of his stuff. So I was actually struggling to put this episode together. It's my big return episode. What is it that I'm going to do? I want to kill him, but it took me a little minute. And I want to start with a cartoon from the 2000s. The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy. If you're in my age group, I'm pretty sure you remember it. Premise of the show, 2 kids enslaved the Grim Reaper to a lifetime of friendship. And one of the funny things about the show is the Grim Reaper, for whatever reason, he was Jamaican. He had a Jamaican accent. Never really questioned why the Grim Reaper, why death was Jamaican. I just know that it was funny and I enjoyed it. So I remember there was this one episode in particular that he reverted back to his human form. And in his human form, though he had a Jamaican accent, his human form, he had white skin. Now, as a child, I never really questioned that, too busy doing kid activities, other things, not caring about things. But as I got older, I kind of thought about it. I'm like, wait, why is his skin white if he's Jamaican? Maybe it's one of these things that adds a little bit more humor to the show. Well, as the story goes, the animators wanted to model the Grim Reaper, after a gentleman by the name of Greg Eagle. Greg Eagle was the person who voiced Grim, gave him his Jamaican accent and all that. And Greg was black. So they wanted to make him black, but somewhere in production, it was brought to their attention that having a black man being owned by 2 white kids would send the wrong message and bring unwanted attention. Understandably so. And they just decided to make him white. The less controversial decision and the more understandable decision, at the time. And I stumbled across this fact not too long ago. And I decided that I wanted to put it in an episode, so here it is. Now, the craziest part about this entire thing, this entire story that I just told you, is that with my platform, me as a podcaster, somebody who's supposed to, well, not supposed to, but somebody who is believed to report on things on a factual basis. With my position, I could have just made that entire thing up and you would have no idea. And it's not because I outsmarted you or anything. But it's just because we as humans in today's world, we just consume so much information that it's just senseless to fact check it all. And like I said, because I have a podcast, you would assume that I would be responsible with my platform to not just randomly spread lies, whatever the case may be. I'm not lying, by the way. This is actually real. You can look it up yourself. I'm still willing to bet my bottom dollar that none of you bothered to Google it, and that's perfectly fine too. It's not something that you should waste precious time Googling because I've already done it for you. So, like I said, shout out to anyone and everyone who is responsible with their own platform. So, because there's just so much information to consume on a day to day basis, I've actually tried to put distance between myself and technology, whether it's my phone, my iPad, my computer, my TV, my video games, all that. Like I'm trying to separate myself and, just go outside, touch the grass a little bit more. And like most people, my attachment to my phone, my personal devices has grown exponentially within these last 2 years. It's to the point where now I leave my phone on the other side of the room whenever I go to sleep, just because I don't want Instagram or Twitter to be the first things that I look at on the wake up. That's kind of a form of self-control that I'm trying to implement in my day-to-day life. But aside from that, I also noticed that the quality in content, like the quality of the content that I was consuming, was lacking. I'm not just talking about the shows and the movies that I watch. I'm also talking about my social media feed, my news feed, and the list goes on. Like I often found myself questioning why certain things were being reported on, why certain things were being presented to me when I had little to no interest in it whatsoever. And you couple that with the fact that there's just too much misinformation out there. There's just so much news, there's just so much clippings, there's just so much information that's going out that hasn't been properly vetted and nobody's going to do the work. And since it's kind of believable, we're just going to tout it as fact and just keep it pushing. I say all of that to say there has to come a time when you look at your phone, you look at your computer, and you ask yourself, is my algorithm helping me or hurting me? So I mentioned it a couple times. There's just been this big misinformation problem. And I won't go, especially in recent times, and I won't go over every single one because we don't have that kind of time. And, first episode back, I'm trying to keep this short and sweet. But I'll go over two of them, which I found were very interesting. Now, the first story has to do with everyone's favorite, or at least the younger generation's favorite social media app versus the older generation's favorite social media app. And if you haven't figured it out, I'm talking about TikTok versus Facebook, now known as Meta. So let's go back a couple years. Let's say late 2019, early 2020. TikTok was rising in popularity to become basically the number one social media app used by, of course, the younger generation, but just most users of social media, period. Now, as it continued its rise, there was a report that TikTok was harvesting user data and selling it back to the Chinese government. This, of course, coming at a time, early 2020, April of 2020 to be exact, that there's this budding xenophobia towards Chinese people and Asian Americans because of the COVID-19 outbreak, the COVID pandemic, and just misconceptions on where and how it began and this and that about such and such. So of course you have that xenophobia toward China, but then you couple all of that with the repeated condemnation of the app by partisan pundits on both sides, so both Republicans and Democrats, saying, "Hey, wait a minute, we should put a halt. We should put a halt to TikTok because it might be potentially dangerous." And then, of course, then President Trump's attempted ban on the app in America. And it's crazy to think about, just because, you look at how popular TikTok is today, and you look back at that time, life was uncertain at the beginning of the pandemic. People were trying to keep themselves entertained. And a lot of TikTok creators, they found their niche. They actually started to make their livelihood on the app. So you take that away from someone, and of course, you could always try and switch to a different social media platform. So like, let's say, for example, if I have a TikTok and I get banned, I can always go to Instagram, or I can always go to Twitter, or I can always stick on YouTube. But followings don't always necessarily translate the most seamlessly between platforms and formats. So it would have made things tough for a lot of creators. Thankfully for its American users, and as we all know, TikTok managed to avert the crisis. They managed to keep their operations here in the United States. This is not a political podcast, nor is it a financial podcast. I'm not going to tell you how they managed to do it. But what's wild to me is this. So this was all going on in 2020, but the narrative continued all the way, even up until now. But the crazy thing was that in March of this year, March of 2022, a report came out that it was actually Facebook who was responsible for that narrative to be pushed in the media, that TikTok was a danger to the American youth, was selling information to the Chinese government, et cetera, et cetera. So Facebook, Meta, whichever you want to call it, but it was Facebook at the time, they partnered with this PR company called Targeted Victory. So basically, Facebook and Targeted Victory, they partnered to paint TikTok as a villain to the American youth and as an enemy to the country, or whatever the case may be. They actually even made up stories that there are a bunch of dangerous trends that teens were trying on the app. And that's one of the reasons why the app should be banned in America. These were completely untrue, but credible publications, call it what you want, but credible publications such as the Washington Post, they even reported on some of these stories. Now, the crazy thing is, when asked about this malicious campaign against TikTok, Meta had this to say, and I quote, "We believe all platforms, including TikTok, should face a level of scrutiny consistent with their growing success." If you ask me, it's kind of nasty. Like, I get it. It's kind of a big bank, take a little bank situation where if I was number one for a certain amount of time and then all of a sudden there's a competitor, I understand the thinking behind wanting to do anything and everything to make sure that I stay on top. But it's weird considering Facebook's own history with user data and mishandling of user data, and having to stand in front of in front of Congress about their dealings when it comes to user data. But I digress. So that's the first story. The second case study is on a much smaller scale. It's a little bit more funny. But again, it kind of outlines the dangers of misinformation in general. So we'll switch over to sports media, sports journalism, if you want to call it that, at the end of this little tidbit. Pardon me. There is a Twitter page by the name of Ballsack Sports. I'm not making this up, I promise you. The name of the page is Ballsack Sports. And the account, they present breaking news stories similar to that, like they leverage the style like Woj or Adam Schefter or Stephen A. Smith or any of these any of these popular sports broadcasters, these sports multimedia journalists who are known to be credible and known to be solid sources of information. The thing is, none of the stories are real. It's a completely satirical page. The page, most of the posts that I've seen focus on basketball, but who's to say that they don't cover other sports? But what they do specifically is they they focus on openings. And what I mean by openings, like let's say, take any basketball team, any friction between the players or the front office and the players, whatever the case may be, they take a look at those openings and they exploit them. Many of the posts are obvious fabrications, but some of the posts contain hints of the truth and they sound believable. And because of how many likes and retweets and how many follows the page has, when you factor in all of those things, sometimes you have some people who believe those stories as fact. I kid you not. In the ball sack sports community, they call this phenomenon when people get duped by these stories. They call this getting sacked. So keep that in mind. I never thought that, real sports journalists or anybody would take any of these stories as fact. And I honestly thought that a majority or even all of the followers of the page knew that it's a satirical page, that it's not real stories, especially given how outrageous some of these stories are. But of course, I was wrong. So, case in point, there was one story in particular that went viral. This is when I first became aware of it, or this is around the time when I first became aware of the page. But the post demystified the circumstances behind James Harden's exit from the Brooklyn Nets and his eventual trade to the Philadelphia 76ers. So the story goes, during a practice, Kyrie Irving, who was of course James Harden's teammate on the Nets, was cooking Harden. He was going crazy on him, and at some point he allegedly called him washed. This added to the friction that existed in the team, and then that was one of the reasons that caused James Harden to request an exit from the team. The funny thing about that scenario is it never happened. That story was completely untrue. However, that didn't stop Stephen A. Smith from reporting on the story somewhat on his own platform, First Take. It was crazy because when he brought it up, he prefaced it by saying something to the effect of, according to reports, which in yesteryear that might have meant something, but in today's world, we can see that reports means absolutely nothing. It's like, I heard it from the lady. The lady told me. That's basically what reports is at this point. So, side note, I don't know if I ever said I used to work at Complex on this podcast, but I used to work at Complex, so whatever. But when I used to work there, there was this one story. I'll never forget this. Well, I'll never forget parts of this. I was asked to cover a breaking story on a popular rapper at the time. There was a very publicized incident. I'm not going to say who, just because of the fact that I actually don't even remember who it was. There were a couple of these that I had to write. But what I do remember was the editor told me to include the following phrase. Went something like, quote, "A source close to Complex tells us ... 300 words later, I submitted the article, and shortly after that, the article was published. Now, I'll be honest with you. As somebody who's participated in music culture, hip hop culture, whatever you want to call it, as a fan for a majority of his life, this was a couple of years ago, when I submitted that story and when it got published and when I saw all of the clicks and retweets and whatever the case may be, I got excited, and I was happy to be at the forefront of a breaking news story. Like, it feels good. I won't deny that it feels good to be the first to report on something, to kind of be the person who provides this information to the masses, information that may or may not be important. So later in the day, I saw other publications pick up on the story and the same story, and they cited my story, the story that I had written, the story that was published on Complex, the website, They use that story as the source for their own news article. And what I saw in all of those articles after mine was something like according to Complex, a source close to such and such rapper says blah 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 whatever. Now, fortunately for me, I trusted the word of the person who told me to include that verbiage in the article. You know, I was privy to conversations with him. I knew that this is not somebody who would just make something up for the purpose of making something up. And this is somebody who also had relationships with the people who are close to many hip hop stars or even hip hop stars themselves. But you know, when you hear according to a source, according to reports, it's a bar. Don't ask me how. When you hear all of those things, you know, you gotta take it with a grain of salt, because who's to say that this is a credible source or a credible report, or even if the source exists or the report exists at all. There are times that I miss working in the news media space, specifically music journalism. I often found myself on the cutting edge of stories that were just about to be broken, things that were not necessarily mind blowing or earth shattering, but just things that were important from a music lover's perspective. Many times. You know, it was an honor and a privilege to present those stories on a platform as large as the one that I was featured on. The few that I was featured on, as a matter of fact. But there came a time when I was like, yo, what is it that I'm writing on exactly? Like, why is this important? And who is this important to? And why should anybody care about this shit? Like, for real. And most times, those same stories, the ones that I was confused while I was writing, would be the ones that would perform the best. One in particular that was a pretty high performer, I remember, was when Wendy's announced that they were bringing their spicy chicken nuggets due to or in part thanks to a Chance the Rapper tweet. Damn. You remember Chance the Rapper? I digress. But I just would wonder, like, yo, why is it that I'm writing on these stories day in and day out? Like, why aren't we talking about the things that matter, you know? But these were the stories that brought the traffic, and the traffic means ad revenue. And, you know, ad revenue has become one of the main drivers behind why a lot of these organizations do the things they do. A lot of these organizations report on the way they report. And I always found it odd that ads ran next to news. Like, why is somebody paying for an ad spot next to something that should be balanced, that should be objective, that should be fair? Like, why are why are companies allowed to buy that space? And the reason why I ask that is, think about it. You know, your ad space is valuable when you have more eyes looking at your platform, whether it's a TV station, whether it's a radio station, eyes and ears in that case, whether it's a um, a website or whatever the case may be. The value of that ad space increases exponentially when you have market share of the viewership, when you have control of the market share of the viewership. Excuse me. There's a on HBO. There's this show called The Newsroom. It's one of my favorite shows on there. It came out the beginning of the last decade, so early 2010s. I won't bore you with the premise of the show. There's this one clip that went viral about why America isn't the greatest country in the world, the greatest nation in the world. That was their most popular clip from that series. But I want to play you another clip that kind of goes over what I just referred to, what I just hinted to when talking about news and ads. And I'll try to keep this clip short, but take from it what you will.
Diligence. The reason we failed isn't a mystery. We took a dive for the ratings. In the infancy of mass communication, the Columbus and Magellan of broadcast journalism, William Paley and David Sarnoff, went down to Washington to cut a deal with Congress. Congress would allow the fledgling networks free use of taxpayer-owned airwaves in exchange for one public service. That public service would be 1 hour of airtime set aside every night for informational broadcasting, or what we now call the evening news. Congress, unable to anticipate the enormous capacity television would have to deliver consumers to advertisers, failed to include in its deal the one requirement that would have changed our national discourse immeasurably for the better. Congress forgot to add that under no circumstances could there be paid advertising during informational broadcasting. They forgot to say the taxpayers will give you the airwaves for free, and for 23 hours a day you should make a profit, but for 1 hour a night you work for us. And now
I personally couldn't have put it better myself. So to end today's episode, I'll be fully transparent. I struggled to put this specific episode with these topics together because on the surface, it kind of feels like seemingly mundane shit. But I really want you, like, if you've made it this far, I really want you to think about, like, to think critically about the stuff that populates your phone, the stuff that populates all of your screens. You know, people always ask me all the time, like, yo, for example, like, yo, why don't you have a TikTok, or why don't you follow people? Like, why don't you follow more people on Twitter or Instagram or whatever the case may be? The short and simple answer is, yo, I really don't want to see any of that shit. Like, I go on digital purges, digital cleanses on a bi-weekly to monthly basis. And what I mean is, I go through my messages, I delete a whole bunch of media there, I go through my camera roll, delete all that stuff, or delete stuff that I just don't need, delete some apps, just anything that's just taking up space, all the digital clutter. I try to keep it to a minimal, just because of the fact that, yeah, it's not taking up physical space, but the fact that it's populating my phone, the fact that it's there, it is still taking up valuable real estate that could be used for something else, A. And B, things that just serve no purpose have no business being on my phone, full stop. Technology in today's world has just advanced to the point that we're over-reliant on this one tech buzzword that I said at the beginning of the episode, starts with an A. It's one of those concepts that I'm honestly sick of hearing. It's becoming overused, but then at the same time, it's one of the single most important concepts in today's world. And that word, if you haven't guessed it already, is algorithm. You know, news articles, IG posts, etc. Algorithms, they utilize our digital behaviors to curate this experience that's supposed to be tailored to our needs, our wants, our desires, etc. Though it's designed to work in our favor, that isn't always the case. You know, think about the purpose of all of this curated content, curated by AI, of course. All right, take Instagram for example. Say in a given week you like a post about I don't know, like a car. Let's say you see a car that you really like and you like that post. You keep scrolling and then you see another post of a car that you like, or cars, concept cars, or whatever the case may be, and you like that too. And you see a car-centric page and you follow that page. And you continue to do this throughout the entire week, whether it's your home page or your explore page, because they found a way to kind of sneak ads and other accounts into other pages into your home page. But whether it's either of those two spaces, your feed now becomes populated with car-centric content. It curated that experience that's tailored to your interest, or specifically what you told the app that your interests are in that specific week. You spend X amount of time on the app and you've liked X amount of posts, and 65% of them were about cars. And that's definitely not giving you the entire story, but that's the gist of how these algorithms work. And just think about that. And if there's one thing to take away from this episode, just be more intentional with how you use technology. And that's it. Jesus Christ, let me take these glasses off. Damn. Shout out to Glasses Kyle. That's a good guy right there. Again, if you're listening to this, I appreciate it. If you're not watching on YouTube, a lot of these things that I'm saying and doing, they have more context on the YouTube. Shout out to all the subscribers there. If you're listening, please consider going there, giving me a subscribe, like hitting the subscribe button or whatever. Damn, I'm begging for YouTube subscriptions. This is what my life has come to. Nah, but for real, I appreciate y'all coming back and listening. I know it's been a minute. Like I said, at some point I'm gonna address why exactly I took all the time off that I did. But for now, peace.